Did you know that the most powerful man in one of the world's most strategically vital nations never actually wanted power the way the world imagines powerful men do? Did you know that behind the austere robes, behind the iron curtain of ideology and revolution, there was once a boy, barefoot on the sun-baked streets of a provincial Iranian city, who fell so deeply in love with poetry that his mother would find him whispering verses to himself in the dark? What if I told you that this same boy, this son of a struggling cleric who could barely afford bread, would one day hold the fate of 100 million people in his hands, and that the road between those two moments was paved not with ambition, but with something far more dangerous: belief? Can you imagine being shaped by a world so full of contradiction, so trembling with ancient faith and modern fury, that by the time you understood who you were, the world had already decided who you must become? Sit with that for a moment. Because this is not a story about politics in the way you might expect. This is not a dry recounting of dates and decrees. This is a story about a human being, a complicated, deeply scarred, deeply devoted human being whose life became inseparable from the destiny of a nation. And like all the great stories of history, it begins not with thunder, but with silence. The silence of a small home in Mashhad. The silence of a boy reading by candlelight. The silence before everything changed. Close your eyes for just a moment and try to feel it. The year is 1939. You are standing on a narrow, dusty lane in the holy city of Mashhad in northeastern Iran. The air smells of saffron and clay. The sound of the call to prayer drifts across the rooftops like a slow tide. Women in black chadors move through the bazaar like shadows. Old men sit outside tea houses, their prayer beads clicking in a steady, meditative rhythm. There was a world here that has existed for centuries, almost unchanged, as if history forgot to knock on this particular door. And yet, underneath the surface, something is stirring. A young country is being remade by foreign hands. An ancient civilization is being asked, no, forced, to forget itself. You are not just watching history, you are standing inside it, breathing its air, feeling its weight on your chest. It is into this world, this specific, irreplaceable world, that Ali Hosseini Khamenei was born on April 19, 1939. His father was Sayyid Jawad Khamenei, a modest religious scholar, a man whose whole life was devoted to faith and learning, and whose devotion to both left precious little room for financial comfort. The family lived in the Nawab neighborhood of Mashhad, a neighborhood that was not poor in spirit, but was unquestionably poor in material terms. There were times, by most accounts, when there was simply not enough food, when the children went to sleep hungry, when Sayyid Jawad would sit quietly in the small room, his face illuminated by the soft glow of an oil lamp, lost in some sacred text, perhaps searching its words for the kind of peace that the day had failed to offer. His mother, Khatija Mir Hussein, was a woman of quiet strength, the kind of woman who holds a family together through sheer force of will, who makes sacrifice look effortless because she has decided that her children will not feel the weight of it. Ali was the second of 8 children, 8 lives competing for space, for attention, for the few resources a cleric's salary could stretch to cover. In such households, you either disappear into the noise, or you find your own interior world. Ali found his interior world, and that interior world, from the very beginning, was made of words. He learned to read young, unusually young, and what drew him with an almost magnetic pull were not just the religious texts that filled every corner of his father's home. It was Persian classical poetry. Hafez, Rumi, Ferdowsi, Sadi. These weren't simply poems to young Ali, they were entire universes. They were maps of the human soul. He would memorize verses the way other children memorize songs, turning them over in his mind, tasting the syllables. There is something extraordinary about a child who finds his deepest comfort not in play, but in language, who learns, before he fully understands what loss or longing or love truly are, to feel those things through the words of poets who have been dead for centuries. And yet this was not a sheltered life. Mashhad was not a bubble. It was, in fact, one of the most politically charged cities in Iran. As a major religious and cultural center, home to the great shrine of Imam Riza, the 8th Shia Imam, it was a city where religion and politics were never truly separate. The streets carried rumors, the tea houses hummed with discontent, and the man sitting on the peacock throne in Tehran, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, was pressing down on the country with increasing weight, backed by British and American interests that most ordinary Iranians could feel but not quite name. The Iran of Ali's childhood was a country in quiet crisis, a country that sensed it was being sold piece by piece to forces it did not choose and could not control. Syed Jawad, for all his scholarly quietude, was not a man who kept his opinions entirely to himself. The family belonged to a tradition of Shia scholarship that had always maintained at its core a deeply political consciousness, the idea that the clergy had not just a spiritual role, but a social and political responsibility. These ideas didn't hit Ali all at once. They seeped into him slowly, the way water seeps into stone, through conversations overheard, through the tone of his father's voice when certain names were mentioned, through the subtle way the adults around him would fall silent when strangers walked too close.
There is a particular kind of education that happens not in classrooms, but in the atmosphere of a household, in the unspoken rules, in what is said at the dinner table and what is carefully not said. Ali was absorbing all of it, storing it, filing it away in that extraordinary interior library he was building. By the time he was a young teenager, two things had become clear about Ali Hosseini Khamenei. First, he was intellectually exceptional. His capacity to read, retain, and synthesize information was remarkable, even among the children of religious scholars who were often themselves quite learned. Second, he was not content. Not in the way that restless, troubled young men are discontented. He was not angry or scattered or lost. He was the opposite. He was intensely focused, almost unnervingly so. But beneath that focus was a deep, churning dissatisfaction with the state of the world around him. He could see, even then, even in those early years, that something was profoundly wrong, that his people, his country, his faith, his civilization were being diminished. And the question that had begun to form in his mind, slowly and with great seriousness, was not whether something could be done, it was whether he was the one who would do it. At 15, following the path that had been laid before him by family, tradition, and his own inclination, Ali began his formal religious studies. He entered the Hawza, the traditional seminary system of Shia Islam, first in Mashhad, and then, in a move that would prove pivotal, in Najaf, Iraq. Najaf was, and remains, one of the holiest cities in Shia Islam. It is the city where Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib, the first Shia Imam, the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad, is buried. To study in Najaf was to step into the very heartbeat of Shia scholarship. It was to breathe the same air that had been breathed by centuries of the greatest minds in Islamic jurisprudence. But the Najaf that young Ali entered was not merely a place of spiritual study. It was also a place of intellectual ferment. There were scholars there wrestling not just with questions of theology, but with questions of power and justice and resistance. And it was here, in this ancient city on the banks of the Euphrates, that Ali Khamenei's world began to expand in ways he had not anticipated. He was still young, still forming, still, in many ways, more poet than politician. There are accounts, warm, human accounts, of the young seminary student writing verses in the margins of his notebooks, of his love for Persian literature remaining alive and urgent even in the midst of demanding theological study. He carried Hafez with him the way others carry photographs. And perhaps it is not so strange. Great poetry and great conviction share the same root. They both demand that you feel the truth of something, not merely understand it intellectually. But Najaf would not hold him forever. He returned to Iran, and specifically to Mashhad, where he continued his studies and began to teach. And it was in those years of teaching, explaining, debating, transmitting ideas that another dimension of Ali Khamenei began to emerge. He was not just a scholar, he was a communicator. He had an unusual gift for taking complex, layered religious and philosophical ideas and translating them into language that ordinary people could not just follow, but feel. His lectures drew students, his study circles grew. Quietly, without fanfare, he was beginning to build something, not a following exactly, but a presence. And then came the meeting that changed everything. In the late 1950s, Ali Khamenei encountered the ideas and eventually the physical presence of a man who was at that moment still more scholar than legend, Ruhollah Khomeini. Khomeini was not yet the towering world historical figure he would become. He was a senior religious authority in Qom, increasingly vocal in his criticism of the Shah's regime, increasingly willing to say out loud what many others only dared to whisper. And what he was saying resonated with Ali Khamenei at a frequency that went beyond intellectual agreement. It felt, by his own later account, like recognition, like encountering in another human being the articulation of something you had felt your entire life but had not yet found words for. There is a moment in every life, if you are paying attention, if you are honest with yourself, when you meet an idea or a person or an experience that acts like a key, that unlocks something in you that had been waiting, perhaps for years, to be opened. For Ali Khamenei, Khomeini was that key. He committed himself completely. He became not just a follower in the passive sense, but an active participant in a growing movement of religious opposition to the Shah's regime. This was not a safe choice. It was, in fact, an extraordinarily dangerous one. The Shah's secret police, Savak, were watching. Lists were being kept. Meetings were being monitored. The cost of open dissent in Iran in those years was not abstract. People disappeared. People were tortured. People died. Ali Khamenei knew this. He chose to continue anyway. And that choice, made quietly in the full knowledge of its consequences, in a country that was beginning to tremble under the pressure of forces that would soon crack it open, that choice is where this story truly begins. Because the boy who grew up hungry in Mashhad, who fell in love with Hafez by candlelight, who carried his questions and his convictions through the houses of two countries, was about to step out of the interior world he had so carefully built and into the blazing, unforgiving light of history. He was still young, still in many ways still becoming, but something had shifted, something had locked into place. And in the years ahead, that shift would set in motion a chain of events so consequential, so far-reaching, so utterly improbable that even now, even with the full weight of hindsight, it is almost impossible to believe that it all began here, in a small house, in a holy city, with a boy and a book of poems and a question he could not stop asking. The revolution was coming, and Ali Hosseini Khamenei was walking straight towards it.
There is a particular kind of courage that the world rarely celebrates. Not the courage of the battlefield, not the courage of the grand gesture made in front of crowds, but the courage of the quiet decision, the kind made alone, in a small room, in the middle of the night, when everything logical inside you is screaming to turn back, when the rational voice, the self-preserving voice, the voice that sounds remarkably like wisdom, is telling you that what you are about to do will cost you everything, and you do it anyway. Not because you are unafraid, but because you have decided that the fear is simply not the most important thing in the room. Ali Khamenei made that kind of decision more than once in his life, but the first time, the time that set the template for everything that followed, came when he was still a young man, still relatively unknown, still building, quietly and carefully, the architecture of a life devoted to something larger than himself. And what makes that decision so extraordinary is not just what it was, but what it cost him, almost immediately, as if the universe needed to test right away whether he truly meant it. He meant it. Pick up the thread of his life in the early 1960s, and what you find is a young religious scholar who has made his choice but is still learning with the particular intensity of someone who knows that time is not guaranteed how to be effective. He had returned to Iran from Najaf, carrying with him not just theological knowledge, but something rarer, a political consciousness, sharpened by proximity to Khomeini's ideas and a personal sense of urgency about the state of his country. Iran under the Shah was modernizing, at least on the surface. Tehran was getting taller. Western fashion was appearing in shop windows. The oil money was building highways and universities. But underneath that gleaming surface, something was being eroded, something older, deeper, harder to name, and millions of Iranians, especially those rooted in the religious and traditional communities that made up the backbone of the country, felt that erosion in their bones, even when they couldn't articulate it in words. Khamenei could articulate it. That was the gift. That was the thing that made him different from simply being one more young cleric with strong convictions. He could take the grief and the anger and the dislocation that ordinary people felt and give it shape, give it language, give it, and this is the crucial part, a direction. He was teaching now in Mashhad, leading study circles, translating important Islamic texts from Arabic into Persian so that the ideas they contained were no longer locked behind the barrier of a language most ordinary Iranians couldn't read. This work, the translation work, tells you something essential about who Ali Khamenei was in those years. He was not interested in keeping knowledge elevated, abstract, inaccessible. He wanted it on the ground. He wanted it in the hands of people who had no formal religious education. He understood, perhaps better than many of his contemporaries, that ideas only become power when they reach the people who need them most. But ideas on paper were not enough, not anymore, not in the Iran of the early 1960s, where history was accelerating. In June of 1963, everything cracked open. Khomeini, by this point, had become openly confrontational with the Shah's government. He had spoken out against the White Revolution, the Shah's package of Western-influenced reforms, and against what he saw as the creeping subjugation of Iran to American and Israeli influence. The government's response was swift and brutal. Khomeini was arrested, and across the country, but especially in the religious cities of Qum, Tehran, and Mashhad, protests erupted. The government sent in soldiers, and in the days that followed, the days that Iranians would come to call the uprising of 15 Khordad, hundreds of people were killed in the streets. Ali Khamenei was in the middle of it, not as a bystander, not as an observer standing at a safe distance, watching history happen to other people. He was in it, speaking, organizing, using every platform available to him, the mosque, the study circle, the informal gathering, to keep people informed, to sustain the momentum of dissent, to ensure that the deaths on those streets were not simply absorbed into silence. This was the moment when the private commitment he had made became a public one, when the interior world he had spent years building was forced, by circumstances, to express itself outward. The government took notice. His first arrest came not long after. He was taken in, held, interrogated, released, then arrested again. The pattern would repeat itself over the years that followed, with a grim regularity that speaks to both his persistence and the authorities' growing awareness that this particular young cleric was not going to quietly disappear. He was arrested a total of 6 times between the early 1960s and the Revolution of 1979. 6 times he was taken from his life, from his teaching, his writing, his family, and placed in a cell. And 6 times he emerged not broken, not quieted, but more resolute than before. There is something worth pausing on here, because it would be easy, dangerously easy, to turn those arrests into simple heroic moments. The brave dissident, dragged away by the oppressive state, emerging stronger each time. The reality was almost certainly more complicated and more human than that. Prison is not a crucible that refines everyone equally. For some, it breaks something. For some, it introduces a coldness, a hardness that never fully thaws. What was it doing to Ali Khamenei? What was it doing to the young man who loved Hafez and translated Arabic texts by lamplight? By his own account, in speeches and writings from later years, those periods of imprisonment were times of intense internal work, of reading, of thinking, of a particular kind of solitary confrontation with oneself that most people spend their entire lives successfully avoiding. There is a tradition in Shia Islam of finding meaning in suffering, not masochistically, not as an end in itself, but as a spiritual discipline, a way of understanding through the body and through deprivation things that the comfortable life cannot teach. Whether Khamenei consciously framed his imprisonment in those terms, or whether that framing came later in retrospect, is impossible to know. But what seems clear is that he did not waste those hours. He came out of each incarceration with something, a sharpened sense of purpose, a more fully developed understanding of what he was fighting and why.
And through all of it, he kept writing. This is the part of Ali Khamenei's story that often gets lost, swallowed by the enormity of what came later, but it matters. It matters because it reveals a dimension of his character that resists the flat, one-dimensional portrait that both his most devoted supporters and his harshest critics tend to paint. He was a writer, a serious one, not just theological treatises, not just political pamphlets, though he wrote those too, but literary criticism. He wrote about Persian poetry with genuine passion and genuine insight. He translated Sayyid Qutb's work from Arabic, a controversial choice that showed his engagement with the broader currents of Islamic political thought across the Muslim world. He was, in the truest sense, an intellectual, a man for whom ideas were not just instruments of power, but were in themselves the very substance of a meaningful life. And yet, he was also becoming something else. Something that the quiet, bookish boy from Mashhad could not entirely have predicted for himself. He was becoming, slowly and unmistakably, a political operator. Not in the cynical sense, not a man who had abandoned principle for pragmatism, but in the real sense. He was learning how movements work, how people work, how to build coalitions, how to read a room, read a crowd, read a moment, how to know when to speak and when to wait. These are not skills that come from books. They come from years of experience, from mistakes made and lessons absorbed, from the particular education that only the real world, with all its friction and unpredictability, can provide. The 1960s became the 1970s, and the pressure on Iran was building. The Shah's regime was growing more repressive, not less. Savak, the secret police, had become a byword for fear across the country. Torture was not a rumor, it was a reality that thousands of Iranians had experienced directly and that hundreds of thousands more had experienced through people they loved. The gap between the glittering modernity the Shah was projecting to the outside world and the reality of life for ordinary Iranians, especially outside Tehran, especially in the religious communities, especially among the poor, was becoming impossible to ignore. Khamenei was in Mashhad through much of this period, continuing to build his network, his reputation, his influence. He was connected now to the broader web of opposition, not just to Khomeini's circle, but to the network of revolutionary thinkers and organizers that was slowly, carefully taking shape across the country. He knew people. More importantly, people knew him. And what they knew of him, his scholarship, his courage under repeated arrest, his ability to communicate ideas across the divide between the learned and the ordinary, made him valuable, made him trusted. But trust in a revolutionary movement is a complicated thing. It is not simply admiration. It comes with expectation, with obligation, with the implicit understanding that when the moment comes, when the crisis arrives, when the choice has to be made between the safe path and the necessary one, you will not flinch. And so we arrive in 1977, 2 years before the revolution. The atmosphere in Iran had changed. You could feel it in the streets of Mashhad, of Tehran, of Qom. Something was different, a quality of tension in the air that was unlike the tension of the years before, more electric, more urgent, closer to the surface. The Shah's regime was cracking under the pressure of its own contradictions. International human rights criticism was mounting, economic grievances were spreading, and across the country, in mosques and universities and factories and bazaars, people who had never spoken openly about politics were beginning to speak, quietly at first, then louder. Khamenei was not quiet. He was delivering lectures, writing, organizing, pushing constantly against the limits of what was permissible. He was involved in creating cultural and intellectual spaces, film screenings, literary societies, discussion circles that served a dual purpose, genuine cultural engagement, and beneath the surface, the slow, patient work of building a revolutionary consciousness. He understood something that many pure ideologues miss. The people do not join movements simply because they are told the movement is right. They join because they feel something, because they are moved, because the movement speaks to some part of them that had been waiting to be addressed. Culture does that work. Art does that work. And Khamenei, with his deep literary sensibility, understood this intuitively in a way that many of his revolutionary colleagues did not. Then came the blow that nearly stopped everything. In 1977, Khamenei was once again arrested, but this time the sentence was more severe. He was sent to Iran-Shar, a remote, harsh exile in the southeast of the country, near the border with Pakistan. Far from Mashhad, far from his networks, far from everything and everyone that gave his daily life its texture and its meaning. This was not simply an arrest. This was designed to erase him, to remove him so thoroughly from the landscape of opposition that when he eventually returned, if he returned, he would be diminished, irrelevant, forgotten. It did not work. In exile, he did what he had always done. He read, he wrote, he thought. He refused, with a stubbornness that must have genuinely frustrated his jailers, to become the broken, demoralized figure the exile was designed to produce. And perhaps more importantly, the country was changing too fast for any exile to hold. Events were outpacing the government's ability to manage them. The tide was coming in, and no prison wall, no remote outpost in the southeastern desert was going to hold it back. He returned from exile in 1978 to a country that was on fire. The revolution was not coming anymore. The revolution was here. And standing in the middle of it, older now, scarred in ways that don't always show on the surface, but unbroken, genuinely, stubbornly, almost incomprehensibly unbroken, was Ali Hosseini Khamenei, the boy from Mashhad who had chosen, all those years ago, to walk toward the thing that frightened him rather than away from it. He had survived the preparation. He had survived the exile. He had survived everything the Shah's regime had thrown at him, not because he was invincible, he was not, but because he had made a decision, somewhere deep in the core of himself, about what mattered more than his own comfort, more than his own safety, more even than his own life. Now the revolution he had spent nearly 2 decades preparing for was erupting around him. Khomeini was returning from exile. Millions of Iranians were in the streets. The old world was collapsing in real time, and the new world, terrifying, exhilarating, full of possibility and danger in equal measure, was rushing in to fill the space. What would it ask of him? What would it cost? And in the chaos of rebirth, in the extraordinary, disorienting, intoxicating moment when a nation reinvents itself almost overnight, who would Ali Hosseini Khamenei prove to be? The answers were coming, fast, faster than anyone could have prepared for, and some of them were glorious, and some of them would leave marks that never fully healed.
There is a particular kind of chaos that feels, in the moment you were living inside it, like liberation.
where the old structures are crumbling so fast, so completely, that the air itself seems to taste different, where ordinary people are doing extraordinary things simply because the invisible walls that had always told them what was possible have suddenly, overnight, ceased to exist, where a nation of millions is collectively holding its breath, suspended between what it was and what it might become, trembling with the specific, unrepeatable electricity of a world being remade. Iran in the winter and spring of 1979 was that kind of chaos, and Ali Khamenei was standing in the middle of it, not as a spectator, not even simply as a participant, but as one of the architects of what was unfolding. A man who had spent nearly 2 decades in the preparation, who had been arrested, exiled, interrogated, stripped of his freedom again and again, was now watching the impossible become real, was now breathing the air of a revolution that had seemed for so many of those long years more like a prayer than a plan. But here is what they never show you in the triumphant footage of revolutionary moments. Here is what the crowds and the flags and the chanting cannot capture. Even as the old regime was collapsing, even as the Shah was packing his bags and the Pahlavi dynasty was breathing its last, the men and women who had fought for this moment were already beginning to disagree about what exactly they had won, about what the new Iran would look like, about who it would belong to, about what kind of power would fill the vast, terrifying vacuum that revolution always leaves in its wake. The revolution was real. The unity, it would turn out, was not. Khamenei returned to Iran on February 1, 1979, stepping off a plane at Mehrabad Airport in Tehran to a reception so massive, so emotionally overwhelming that the images from that day still carry a physical force even now, decades later. Millions of people lined the streets. Millions more watched on television sets across the country, in tea houses and living rooms and mosques, hearts hammering with something that was equal parts joy and terror. The man who had become, from his exile in Paris, the voice and the symbol of everything the revolution promised, he was home, and nothing would ever be the same. Ali Khamenei was there, in the inner circle, in the rooms where things were being decided, where the shape of the new Iran was being argued over and hammered out in real time. He was not the most famous face, he was not the most senior cleric, but he was trusted, deeply trusted, by Khamenei himself and by the broader network of revolutionary insiders who understood that trust, in those chaotic early months, was the only currency that actually meant anything. He was appointed to the Revolutionary Council, the body tasked with the almost impossibly complex work of governing a country in the immediate aftermath of a revolution. Think about what that actually means for a moment. The entire administrative apparatus of the old regime had to be either dismantled, repurposed, or rebuilt from scratch. The military had to be reconstituted, the economy had to be stabilized, foreign relationships had to be renegotiated, and all of this had to be done not in conditions of peace and order, but in the middle of ongoing turmoil, with armed groups of various ideological stripes competing for influence, with the remnants of the old regime still present in the institutions, with the United States and other foreign powers watching closely and making their own calculations. It was, by any measure, one of the most demanding governance challenges of the 20th century, and the men tasked with meeting it were, for the most part, scholars and activists and ideologues who had spent their careers in opposition, who were expert at resistance, but now were being asked to do something entirely different, to build, to govern, to make the thousand unglamorous, compromising, difficult decisions that power always demands. Khamenei threw himself into it. He became, in those early years of the Islamic Republic, something of a utility player in the best possible sense, a man whose combination of religious credibility, political sharpness, and personal courage made him genuinely useful across multiple fronts simultaneously. He was involved in the founding of the Islamic Republican Party, the political vehicle through which the clerical establishment would consolidate its hold on the new government. He served as the Friday prayer leader of Tehran, a role that was far more politically significant than it might sound. The Friday sermon was, in those years, one of the primary channels through which the government communicated with the population, and the man delivering it was not merely a religious figure, but a political one. And then came the war. In September of 1980, Iraqi forces under Saddam Hussein crossed the border into Iran. The invasion was, by Saddam's calculation, an opportunistic strike, a bet that the revolutionary government was too chaotic, too disorganized, too consumed by its own internal contradictions to mount an effective defense. It was a calculation that would prove catastrophically wrong. But in those first terrible weeks and months, as Iraqi tanks rolled across the border and Iranian cities came under bombardment, the situation looked desperate. Khamenei went to the front. Not as a figurehead, not even on a carefully managed security-protected tour for the cameras. He went as a representative of the Supreme Leader, as a political commissar of sorts, tasked with maintaining morale, with communicating the government's commitment to the soldiers dying in the dust and the mud of the borderlands. He gave speeches in field hospitals. He sat with wounded soldiers. He prayed with men who knew they might not see another sunrise. And in doing so, he was doing something that mattered. He was making the revolution feel present, feel real, feel accountable at the very moment when it would have been easiest to feel abandoned. And then came the moment that almost ended everything. On June 27, 1981, Ali Khamenei was delivering a speech in a mosque in Tehran. He was holding the microphone with his right hand, speaking to the congregation, when a bomb hidden inside a tape recorder detonated. The explosion tore through the room. People were thrown to the ground, the air filled with smoke and screaming. In the immediate chaos, it was not clear who had survived and who had not. Khamenei survived, but his right arm did not. The nerves were destroyed. The damage was permanent and irreversible. He would never again have full use of his right hand, the hand he had used to write, to translate, to gesture while speaking, to reach towards the world. The arm would hang, partially paralyzed for the rest of his life, a permanent, visible reminder of the cost of the path he had chosen. Sit with what that means for a moment. He was 42 years old. He had already given the better part of 2 decades to this cause. He had been imprisoned 6 times, exiled, separated from his family, and now his body itself had paid a price. And yet, and here is the thing that whatever your feelings about the man or the system he represented demands an honest recognition, he did not retreat. He did not step back. He did not find a quiet corner of the new republic and decide that he had given enough. Within weeks he was back, speaking, working, governing, with one arm, with the particular focused intensity of a man who has looked directly at death and decided that it is simply not going to be the end of the sentence.
But the explosions were not only physical. The early 1980s were a period of extraordinary violence and instability in Iran, a period that the Islamic Republic does not discuss easily or openly, and that history is still, in many ways, working to fully understand. The Mujahideen-e-Khalq, the MEK, a leftist Islamist group that had participated in the revolution and then turned violently against the clerical government, was waging what amounted to a terrorist campaign against the leadership of the new republic. In the summer of 1981, a bomb killed the president of Iran and the prime minister in a single explosion. The head of the judiciary was killed. Dozens of officials, clerics, and government figures were assassinated. The revolution was devouring some of its own children, and the government's response, a brutal crackdown that itself claimed thousands of lives, would leave wounds in the fabric of Iranian society that have never fully healed. Khamenei was in the middle of all of it, governing, deciding, bearing the weight of decisions that, in a stable, peaceful country, would have been extraordinary, and that in the conditions of those years were simply the daily reality. He became president of Iran in October of 1981. Let that land for a moment. The boy from Mashhad, the son of a cleric who couldn't always afford bread, the young man who had been arrested 6 times, who had spent years in exile in the southeastern desert, whose right arm had been shattered by an assassin's bomb, was now the president of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the second most powerful man in the country after Khomeini himself. He served 2 terms, 8 years in the presidency,
And those 8 years were, by any standard, among the most difficult anyone could have faced in that office. The war with Iraq was ongoing, grinding, brutal, consuming an entire generation of young Iranians. The economy was under severe strain from both the war and international sanctions. The internal politics of the republic were fiercely contested, with different factions fighting for influence, for resources, for the direction of the revolution itself. And overarching all of it was the immense, sometimes overwhelming presence of Khomeini, the supreme leader whose authority was absolute, whose vision had to be interpreted and implemented by those beneath him, and whose own health was slowly, visibly beginning to fail. Being Khamenei's president was not an easy thing to be. The relationship between the two men was complex, genuinely warm, built on real mutual respect and decades of shared struggle, but also navigated carefully, because Khomeini's authority was not merely institutional, but almost metaphysical in its weight. To serve under him was to constantly calibrate, to always be aware of the distinction between your own views and the views that you are authorized to act upon. For a man as intellectually independent as Khamenei, a man with his own reading of Islamic jurisprudence, his own political instincts, his own carefully formed opinions about what the revolution should be and where it should go, that calibration must have required a particular kind of discipline. And there were moments of friction, quiet, carefully managed, mostly invisible to the outside world, but real. Khamenei and the Prime Minister, Mir Hossein Mousavi, disagreed frequently and sometimes sharply on economic policy. Khamenei was more inclined toward private enterprise, more skeptical of the statist economic model that Mousavi favored. These were not abstract disagreements, they were arguments about the material conditions of millions of people's lives. And they played out in the particular way that disputes within revolutionary governments always do, through the accumulation of small decisions, through bureaucratic maneuvering, through the careful deployment of influence and alliance. Through it all, the war continued. The Iran-Iraq War is one of the most catastrophic conflicts of the 20th century, and one of the least examined in the Western world. It lasted 8 years, from 1980 to 1988. It killed somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people. It wounded millions more. It used chemical weapons deployed by Iraq against Iranian soldiers and Kurdish civilians, with the knowledge and, in some cases, the material support of Western governments who had decided that Iraq was the preferable power in the region. It was a war of trenches and human wave attacks and poison gas and teenage martyrs, fought in the marshes and the mountains of a borderland that had been contested for centuries. For Khamenei, the war was not an abstraction. He had been to the front, he had sat with the dying, he had given speeches in the shadow of artillery fire. And as president, he bore a portion of the political and moral weight of every decision made about how it was fought, and eventually how it was ended. When the ceasefire finally came in 1988, when Khomeini, in a phrase that has echoed through Iranian history since then, described accepting it as drinking a cup of poison, the exhaustion was total. The country had given everything, and what it had received in return was survival, not victory, not the transformation of the region that the most ambitious voices of the revolution had promised. Just survival, the painful, expensive, humbling kind. And then, on June 3, 1989, before the dust of the ceasefire had fully settled, before the country had begun to process what the war had cost, before the next chapter of the Republic's story had taken any kind of shape, Ruhollah Khomeini died. The man who had been for an entire decade the gravitational center of everything, of the revolution, of the republic, of the faith of millions, of the political calculations of governments around the world, was gone. And the question that had been, for years, carefully kept out of polite conversation, the question that everyone knew was coming but that no one had fully prepared for, was suddenly, urgently, unavoidably present. Who would lead Iran now?
The answer came with a speed that shocked even the insiders. It came from the assembly of experts, the body of senior clerics empowered to select the supreme leader. It came after deliberations that were, by most accounts, more compressed and more contested than the official narrative has ever fully acknowledged. And it was an answer that surprised much of the world, and perhaps surprised Ali Khamenei himself. Not perhaps, almost certainly. Because the man they chose, the man who would step into the space left by one of the most consequential figures of the 20th century, the man who would inherit the authority and the responsibility and the impossible, crushing weight of that title, was the president, was the cleric with the paralyzed arm, was the boy from Mashhad, was Ali Hosseini Khamenei. He was 50 years old. He was, by the standards of the clerical establishment, relatively junior in religious rank, a point that his critics would raise immediately and that would shadow the early years of his leadership. He had not been Khomeiни's public designated successor. He had not, by most accounts, campaigned for the position or expected it. And yet, there he was, standing at the edge of something vast, so demanding, so utterly without precedent in his own experience, or in anyone's experience, really, that the only honest response was something between awe and terror. The revolution had given him everything he had devoted his life to fighting for, and now it was asking for something more, something beyond what any of the prisons, any of the exiles, any of the bombs had asked for. It was asking him to become the thing itself, to stop being the man who fought for the Islamic Republic and to become the man who was the Islamic Republic, to absorb into his own identity the entire weight of what a nation is and what a nation needs and what a nation costs the person who stands at its center. He stood at the threshold. The door was open. And somewhere in the deep, private interior of the man who had always found his truest self in poetry and in solitude and in the quiet discipline of thought, somewhere in there, something was shifting, something enormous, something that could not be undone. He stepped through.
There is a weight that has no name in any language, not quite power, not quite responsibility, something older than both and heavier than either. It is the weight of becoming the symbol of something larger than yourself, of having your face, your voice, your name, your very existence become inseparable from the fate of a people, of waking up every morning knowing that the decisions you make today will ripple outward in ways you cannot fully predict, touching lives you will never see, shaping futures you will never live to witness. Most human beings spend their entire lives sheltered from that kind of weight. A very small number are called to carry it, and fewer still are called to carry it without having chosen it, without having campaigned for it, maneuvered for it, dreamed of it since youth, to have it placed upon you suddenly and irrevocably by the momentum of history itself. That was the specific, singular burden of Ali Hosseini Khamenei in the summer of 1989. He had not been groomed for this, not explicitly, not in the way that successors to great power are sometimes carefully prepared, introduced gradually to its demands, apprenticed in its rituals, given time to grow into its dimensions. He had been a revolutionary, a prisoner, a soldier's companion in wartime, a president navigating the brutal complexities of a country at war with itself and its neighbor. He had been, in every phase of his life, a man of great seriousness and genuine capability. But Supreme Leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the heir to Khomeini's mantle, the guardian of a revolution that had reshaped the entire geopolitical architecture of the Middle East, that was something else entirely. That was a role so immense, so freighted with expectation and contradiction that it would have tested anyone. And the world was watching, not with admiration mostly, with suspicion, with calculation, with the particular cold attention that powerful nations pay to developments in strategically vital regions when the existing order is suddenly, unexpectedly disrupted. He knew they were watching. The first years of his supreme leadership were, in many ways, a prolonged exercise in the establishment of authority, because here is the uncomfortable truth that the official history of the Islamic Republic prefers to smooth over. When Khamenei was elevated to the position of supreme leader, there were serious doubts inside Iran, inside the clerical establishment, inside the very circles of power that had chosen him about whether he was truly qualified. The issue was religious rank. In Shia Islam, the position of supreme leader carries with it a specific religious authority, the concept of velayat-e-faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, that traditionally required the holder to be among the most senior religious scholars in the land. Khamenei's religious credentials, while genuine, were not at the level of a grand ayatollah. He was an ayatollah, yes, but the gap between that and the rank of grand ayatollah is not merely ceremonial, it is substantive. It carries real weight in the intensely hierarchical world of Shia scholarship. The solution that was engineered, the elevation of his religious rank through a process that itself became controversial, set a precedent and created a vulnerability that Khamenei would spend years working to overcome, not through argument, not through theological debate, but through the slow, patient accumulation of undeniable authority, through decision after decision that demonstrated, whatever questions existed about his formal rank, that his political judgment was formidable, that his grip on the levers of power was real, that he was not a temporary figure, not a placeholder, not a transitional arrangement until someone more suitable could be found. He was here, he was staying, and gradually, unmistakably, he was consolidating. The Iran that Khamenei now led was not the Iran of 1979. A decade of revolution and war had transformed it in ways that were profound and not always in the directions the revolution's founders had intended. The population was younger, dramatically younger than it had been at the time of the revolution. The economy was damaged and distorted by years of conflict and isolation. The intellectual and cultural life of the country, while not dead, had been constrained by the ideological demands of the new order in ways that created genuine, growing frustration among the educated classes. And internationally, Iran was isolated in a way that carried real costs in investment, in technology, in the simple ability to participate in the global economy on anything approaching equal terms. The man tasked with navigating all of this was simultaneously a deeply conservative religious thinker and something that doesn't quite fit any easy Western category, a man with a genuine, sophisticated understanding of history, literature, and political philosophy, who read widely and thought carefully, and whose conservatism was not the simple, reflexive kind, but the considered kind. The kind that has looked at the alternatives and made a judgment, rightly or wrongly, about which path leads to which destination. He brought in Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani as president, a pragmatist, an operator, a man whose comfort with the mechanisms of power and the requirements of economic reality was as natural as breathing. The partnership between Khamenei and Rafsanjani in the early 1990s was one of the defining relationships of the Islamic Republic's post-Khamenei era, and it was, like all genuine political partnerships, built on a complicated mixture of mutual respect, shared interest, and carefully managed tension. Rafsanjani wanted to rebuild the economy, to open Iran up, to normalize its international relations where possible. Khamenei shared some of those goals and had reservations about others. The dance between them, neither fully in agreement nor in open conflict, shaped the character of that decade. And through it all, Khamenei was building something that would prove in the long run more durable than any single policy or alliance. He was building an institutional architecture, a network of relationships, of loyal figures placed in key positions across the military, the judiciary, the media, the religious establishment, the security services, a web of connection and obligation and shared interest that gave the office of the Supreme Leader a structural power that went beyond the personal authority of any individual who held it. He was, in other words, thinking in decades, not in election cycles, not in the short rhythms of democratic politics, in the long, patient time signature of someone who has decided that what he is building is meant to last. This is one of the things that most confounds outside observers trying to understand Khamenei, the timescale on which he operates. Western political analysis tends to move in years, at most in presidential terms. Khamenei thought in generations, in centuries even. He understood, with the particular historical consciousness of a man who had spent his life steeped in Islamic history and Persian civilization, that empires and ideologies and systems of power are built and sustained not by single dramatic gestures, but by the slow, unglamorous accumulation of institutional strength, by patience, by the willingness to absorb short-term costs in service of long-term goals. Then came the moment that would define the middle period of his leadership more than any other, the election of Mohammad Khatami in 1997. Khatami was everything that the conservative establishment had not anticipated and did not want: a reformist, a cleric, yes, but one who spoke the language of civil society and political pluralism and dialogue between civilizations with a fluency and a warmth that electrified the Iranian public, especially the young, the educated, the urban. He won with 70% of the vote, 70%. In a country where elections are never simply exercises in democratic expression, but always simultaneously complex negotiations between competing centers of power, that number was not just a victory, it was a message, a loud, unmistakable, impossible to ignore message from the Iranian people about what they wanted their country to become. Khamenei heard the message, and here is where the story becomes genuinely complicated. Because what followed the election of Khatami, the 8 years of the reform era, was not a simple story of a conservative supreme leader crushing a popular reformist movement, though that is certainly how it has often been told. It was something more layered than that. It was a sustained, grinding confrontation between two visions of the Islamic Republic, between those who believed the revolution's promise could be fulfilled through opening, through pluralism, through the gradual expansion of political and social freedoms, and those who believed that such an opening was precisely the thing that would ultimately destroy what the revolution had built.
Khamenei was in this second camp, firmly, consistently, without visible doubt. He supported Khatami's presidency in his way. He was not openly hostile, did not immediately move to destroy it, but the tools available to him were formidable, and he used them. The Guardian Council, the body empowered to vet legislation for Islamic compliance, blocked or rejected reform legislation with a regularity that became almost rhythmic. The judiciary, firmly under conservative control, prosecuted reformist newspapers, reformist intellectuals, reformist politicians. Student protests were suppressed. The space for reform narrowed year by year, until by the time Khatami's second term ended in 2005, the reformist project felt to many of its supporters like a dream that had been quietly, systematically dismantled. And yet, it is worth asking, genuinely, without predetermined answer, what Khamenei actually believed he was doing in those years. The easy answer, the satisfying answer, is that he was protecting his own power, consolidating, suppressing, ensuring that the architecture he had built would not be dismantled by a wave of popular enthusiasm for things that he believed, rightly or wrongly, the country could not afford. But there is another answer, a more uncomfortable one, that he genuinely believed still, that the kind of opening the reformists envisioned was not a path to a better Iran, but a path to the dissolution of everything the revolution had been built to protect. That the American and Western interest in Iranian reform was not benign, was not simply the expression of universal values about human freedom, but was geopolitical, was strategic, was in the most direct terms another chapter in the long story of foreign powers deciding what Iran should be, regardless of what Iranians themselves had chosen. He had watched, after all, what happened to countries that opened themselves to Western influence in the 20th century. He had grown up in a country that had experienced that influence directly, at cost. His skepticism was not manufactured, it was biographical.
That does not make the suppression of the reform movement right. It does not make the imprisonment of journalists and intellectuals and student activists anything other than what it was. But it complicates the portrait. It insists on a more honest accounting, one that acknowledges the genuine belief system behind the decisions, even while refusing to excuse their consequences. Then came 2005, and Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. The election of Ahmadinejad as president was, in its way, as significant a political earthquake as the election of Khatami had been, just in the opposite direction. A figure from outside the clerical establishment, from the security and military world, with a populist message and a confrontational foreign policy posture, and a style that was deliberately, almost aggressively at odds with the refined, scholarly culture of the traditional Islamic Republic elite. He won. He served 2 terms, and his presidency created a set of problems and dynamics that Khamenei had not entirely anticipated and did not entirely control. The relationship between Khamenei and Ahmadinejad was one of the great complicated political partnerships of the era. Khamenei had, by most accounts, supported Ahmadinejad's rise, seen in him a useful counterweight to the reformists, an energetic loyalist who could be relied on. What he got was something more unpredictable. Ahmadinejad was not a man who was easily managed. He had his own ambitions, his own vision, his own political base, and an instinct for provocation, internationally and domestically, that regularly created crises that Khamenei then had to manage. The nuclear program accelerated during these years. Iran's international isolation deepened. The sanctions tightened. The rhetoric, particularly around Israel, reached a pitch that alarmed not just Western governments, but many within the Islamic Republic itself. And through it all, Khamenei held the line, supporting the nuclear program as a matter of national sovereignty, of the right of an independent nation to pursue scientific and technological capability, managing Ahmadinejad's excesses where he could, watching the international pressure build with what appeared from the outside like imperturbable calm. And then, June 2009, the Green Movement. The disputed presidential election of 2009, in which Ahmadinejad was declared the winner almost immediately after polls closed, in results that millions of Iranians found impossible to believe, produced something that the Islamic Republic had not seen since the revolution itself. Millions of people in the streets, not in one city, in cities across the country, wearing green, chanting, demanding that their votes be counted, demanding to be heard. The faces in those crowds were not the faces of foreign agents or enemies of the revolution. They were the faces of ordinary Iranians, young Iranians, educated Iranians, Iranians who had grown up entirely within the Islamic Republic and who were now standing in the street saying with their bodies and their voices that something had gone profoundly wrong. Khamenei's response was swift and unambiguous. He endorsed the election results. He warned protesters that they would be responsible for the consequences of continued unrest, and then the security forces moved in. The crackdown was brutal. People were killed in the streets. Thousands were arrested. The leaders of the Green Movement, including Mir Hossein Mousavi, Khamenei's own prime minister from the 1980s, were placed under house arrest, where they remain to this day. The movement was crushed, not immediately, but completely. The images from those weeks in 2009 traveled the world. The image of Neda Aga Sultan, a young woman shot dead in Tehran street, her face becoming one of the defining images of the early social media era, seen by hundreds of millions of people within hours of her death. The world watching, the world reacting. And in the office of the Supreme Leader, in the quiet rooms where the decisions were made, Ali Khamenei absorbing the weight of what was happening, what he had authorized, what it meant, what it would cost. What it would cost not just politically, not just diplomatically, but in the long, unforgiving accounting of history. Because here is the question that 2009 posed, that it still poses, with the directness that no amount of geopolitical framing can entirely deflect.
When millions of your own people stand in the street and ask to be heard, and your answer is to send in the security forces, what exactly are you protecting? What is the thing that matters more than the voices of the people in whose name the revolution was made? Khamenei had an answer. He has always had an answer. The answer is the system, the revolution, the architecture of the Islamic Republic as the guarantor of Iranian independence and Islamic values against a world that he genuinely believes would prefer Iran compliant and diminished. The answer is that the voices in the street, however sincere, were being manipulated, consciously or otherwise, by forces whose ultimate goal was not Iranian democracy, but Iranian submission. You can disagree with that answer. Millions do. But it is the answer, and it is his, and it has not changed. The years that followed 2009 were years of entrenchment, of deepening isolation internationally as the nuclear standoff intensified, of an economy squeezed by sanctions to the point where ordinary Iranians felt the pain in the most immediate daily ways, in the price of bread, in the value of the currency, in the simple grinding difficulty of ordinary life. Of a domestic political space that continued to narrow, where the definition of acceptable dissent became steadily more restrictive, where the gap between the government and the governed seemed to many observers to be widening in ways that were not sustainable. And yet, Iran endured, and Ali Khamenei endured, and the system, the complicated, contradictory, resilient, repressive, internally contested system that he had spent 30 years building and defending, endured. Whether that endurance was a testament to the genuine strength of the institutions he had built, or to the depth of the repression that sustained them, or to some irreducible core of Iranian national resilience that would have survived under almost any system, that is a question that historians will argue about for a very long time. What is not in question is this: the man who had started as a boy in Mashhad, who had chosen the hard road so many times that choosing it had become, in some sense, simply who he was, that man was still there, still at the center, still holding on to something, still believing, with whatever complicated mixture of faith and calculation and genuine conviction that sustains a person through decades of consequence and cost, that what he was doing mattered, still believing that the story wasn't over. But the world outside was changing. The region was on fire. The Arab Spring had redrawn the map of the Middle East in ways both liberating and devastating. A nuclear deal was being negotiated, then signed, then torn up, then negotiated again. The Iranian people were restless. In 2017, in 2019, in 2022, rising up again and again, each wave larger than the last, each one met with the same iron response. And Ali Khamenei, older now, visibly aged, the arms still hanging as it had since 1980.
Does Khamenei see that gap? Does he feel it? There are moments, rare, guarded, but present, when something in his public statements suggests that he does. When he talks about the need for innovation, for scientific achievement, for Iran to become a great power, not just in the military and strategic sense, but in the economic and technological sense. When he expresses, in terms that sometimes carry genuine frustration, the gap between the Islamic Republic's potential and its actual condition. Whether that frustration is directed inward, at the system he himself has shaped and defended, or only outward, at the sanctions and the foreign interference and the enemies that he has always cited as the primary obstacles to Iran's flourishing, is a question he has never answered with full transparency. Perhaps he cannot. Perhaps the honest answer to that question would require a reckoning with his own role that even the most self-aware person, after 3.5 decades of ultimate authority, would find nearly impossible to undertake. And yet, there is the poetry. In 2022, a young Iranian woman named Mahsa Amini died in the custody of the morality police. Her death set off a wave of protest. Woman, life, freedom.
that swept across Iran with an intensity and a breadth that even the most hardened observers found startling. Young women removing their hijabs in the streets, young men standing beside them. Across every province, every major city, every social class. The chants were not about foreign policy. They were not about nuclear weapons or regional strategy or geopolitical competition. They were about the right to exist freely, to dress as you choose, to live as you choose, to be recognized as a full human being by the government of your own country. Khamenei called it a riot, blamed foreign interference, and the security forces moved, as they had moved before, to restore order. But something was different this time. The movement did not fade as quickly. The anger did not dissipate, and in the months and years that followed, the sense of a fundamental disconnect between the system as it existed and the Iran that its own people were demanding seemed to deepen rather than resolve. What does a man do at the end of a long life when the evidence suggests that the thing he built, the thing he sacrificed everything for, the thing he defended through imprisonment and exile and assassination attempts and wars and decades of crushing responsibility is not beloved by the people it was built to serve? What does he do with that knowledge, if he allows himself to have it? There are only a few options available to human beings in that position. Some double down, intensify the conviction, amplify the certainty, because the alternative is an internal collapse too devastating to contemplate. Some quietly grieve, holding the gap between the ideal and the reality in a private sorrow that never finds public expression. And some, the rarest kind, find a way to hold the contradiction openly, to say, I believed, I gave everything, and the story did not end the way I hoped, and that is a grief I must carry. Which of these is Ali Hosseini Khamenei? Probably some complicated mixture of all three, as most of us are when we are honest about the distance between what we set out to do and what we actually did. He is, at the end, a man of his civilization, of the deep, layered, ancient Persian Islamic civilization that produced Hafez and Rumi and Ferdowsi, that produced, alongside its faith and its beauty and its extraordinary literary tradition, centuries of political turmoil, of power concentrated and abused, of great ideals imperfectly embodied in very human institutions. He emerged from that civilization. He was shaped by it at the deepest level, and in a very real sense, the contradictions of his life, the genuine devotion and the political repression, the love of poetry and the suppression of poets, the commitment to the dignity of a people and the denial of their most basic freedoms are not unique to him. They are the contradictions of a civilization still working out, painfully and incompletely, who it wants to be. But history does not let individuals off the hook by pointing to the larger patterns they embody. Individuals make choices. Ali Hosseini Khamenei made choices, thousands of them, across more than 30 years of supreme authority. Those choices had consequences, real consequences, in real lives, in the life of a country that deserved and still deserves better than the sum of what any single leader, however devoted, however intelligent, however genuinely convinced of his own righteousness, was able to give it. And perhaps that is the most honest thing that can be said about him. Not that he was a monster, not that he was a saint, but that he was a man, deeply human, deeply formed, deeply convinced, who was given an amount of power that no single human being should probably ever hold, and who used it in the ways that his formation, his fears, his faith, and his history had prepared him to use it, for better and for worse, in ways that will be debated and disputed and argued over for a very long time. The boy who grew up hungry in Mashhad and fell in love with Hafez by candlelight, he is still in there. He never entirely left. And perhaps in the private hours, in the quiet moments between the speeches and the decisions and the weight of everything, he still reaches for the poems. Still finds in the language of a poet dead for 6 centuries the thing that politics cannot give, and power cannot buy, and revolution cannot guarantee. Solace, recognition, the feeling, ancient and irreplaceable, of being understood. Hafez wrote, and Khamenei has quoted him across a lifetime of public speech more times than can be counted, that the heart is a mirror, that what it reflects depends entirely on what stands before it. What stands before Ali Hosseini Khamenei's heart in the final years of a life that has, whatever else it has been, utterly and completely lived, only he knows. Perhaps not even he knows entirely. But the mirror is there. It has always been there, beneath the Supreme Leader and the ideology and the revolution and the decades of consequence and cost. The mirror is there. And in it, if you look closely enough, if you are willing to look past everything that is easier to see, you will find, as you always find at the center of any human life, if you are honest enough to look, not a symbol, not an icon, not a villain or a hero or a cautionary tale, a person. Complicated, scarred, devoted, limited, sincere, and mortal. Just a person. Who believed with everything he had that what he was doing mattered, and who will be remembered long after the last chapter closes, not as the thing he tried to be, but as the full, unresolvable, deeply human thing he was. The story of Ali Hosseini Khamenei is not over, but it is, at last, complete.
There comes a moment in every long life when the future stops feeling infinite, when the horizon, which once seemed to recede endlessly before you no matter how far you walk toward it, begins instead to feel close, definite. When the questions that once felt urgent, what will I build, what will I change, what will I prove, give way, slowly and not always willingly, to a different set of questions. Quieter ones, harder ones, the kind that cannot be answered with a decree or a speech or a strategic decision, the kind that arrive in the small hours of the morning and sit with you in the silence, patient and immovable, waiting for an honesty that power has a long history of making very difficult to practice. Ali Hosseini Khamenei is an old man now. He was born in 1939. He has lived through the reign of 2 Shahs, a revolution, a brutal 8-year war, the deaths of friends and enemies and contemporaries too numerous to count, the rise and fall of movements and leaders and entire geopolitical orders. He has outlasted almost everyone who stood beside him in the early days, the men who made the revolution with their hands and their voices and their willingness to be imprisoned and broken and rebuilt. He has watched the country he helped create change in ways he sanctioned and in ways he could not prevent and in ways he perhaps did not fully understand. He has watched a generation of Iranians grow up knowing nothing of the world before the Islamic Republic, and then watch that same generation stand in the streets and demand something different from it. He is, by any measure, one of the most consequential figures of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. And he is also, beneath all of that, a human being, with a body that has aged and a mind that has carried more than most minds are ever asked to carry, and a soul that has, whatever else you believe about him, been genuinely devoted from the very beginning to something beyond itself. That is where this final chapter begins. Not with policy, not with geopolitics, with the man. In his later years, something in Khamenei's public presentation has shifted, subtly, in ways that are easy to miss if you are only looking at the political surface. He speaks more often about death, not morbidly, not with fear, but with the particular matter-of-factness of someone who has been thinking about it seriously for a long time and has made a kind of peace with what he thinks it means. He speaks about the Quran not as a political document, but as a companion, something he returns to daily, something that has been with him longer than any political alliance or institutional relationship. He speaks about poetry still, even now, quotes Hafez in speeches, returns again and again to the Persian literary tradition that shaped him before anything else did, as if that tradition is the bedrock beneath the bedrock, the thing that remains when everything else is stripped away. There is something in that worth paying attention to, because it suggests that the interior life, the private, contemplative, literary life that the boy in Mashhad began building by candlelight, never entirely disappeared beneath the weight of the Supreme Leader. That somewhere inside the apparatus of power, the person persisted, diminished perhaps, compressed, forced into a smaller and smaller space by the demands of the role, but present, still reading, still listening, still in some fundamental way, still himself. And what does that person, the one beneath the role, make of the life he has lived? It is impossible to know with certainty. He is not a man who invites that kind of transparency, and the system he leads does not reward it in others. But there are clues, fragments, moments when something genuine seems to surface through the official language and the carefully managed public persona. He has spoken in terms that feel unscripted about the loneliness of the position, about the difficulty of knowing, truly knowing, whether the people around you are telling you what is real or what they calculate you want to hear. This is not a small thing. It is, in fact, one of the oldest and most corrosive problems of concentrated power, the way it distorts the information environment around the person who holds it, surrounding them gradually with a kind of insulation that looks like loyalty but functions like isolation. The higher you rise, the fewer people will tell you when you are wrong. And Khamenei has been at the very top for more than 30 decades. 30 decades of being the person in the room whose opinion carries the most weight. 30 decades of the particular exhausting loneliness of ultimate authority. He has spoken about his children. He has 6, with a warmth that cuts through the formal register of his public speeches, about wanting for them a life less consumed by the demands that consumed his own. There is something quietly heartbreaking in that. The revolutionary who gave everything to a cause, who chose the cause again and again, even when the cost was personal and physical and familial, looking at his children and wanting for them the ordinary life he did not allow himself to have. He has spoken about the martyrs, constantly, obsessively, across decades of speeches and writings, the dead who gave their lives for something he helped create, and therefore have a claim on him, a moral claim that no amount of time can dissolve. There are moments watching him speak about the martyrs when you glimpse something raw beneath the controlled surface, something that looks like grief that has never fully found its resolution, like a wound that healed on the outside but not all the way through. And then there are the others, the ones who died differently. The protesters in the streets of 2009, the journalists in prison, the young women who took off their hijabs in the streets after the death of Mahsa Amini in 2022 and paid for that act with imprisonment, with violence, with their freedom, and in some cases their lives. Does he carry those too? Does the man who loves Hafez, who spent his youth translating texts so that ordinary people could access ideas that had been kept from them, does he feel the weight of what has been done in the name of the system he leads to people whose only crime was wanting to be heard? There is no clean answer to that question, and the danger of this kind of storytelling, the danger of the intimate, humanizing portrait, is that it can slide, without meaning to, into a kind of false absolution. into the suggestion that because a man is complicated, because he has an interior life and genuine convictions and moments of evident humanity, the consequences of his decisions are somehow softened or excused. They are not. The people who were imprisoned were imprisoned. The people who were killed were killed. The freedoms that were denied were denied. These are not abstractions. They are the lived realities of millions of human beings whose lives were shaped, constrained, and in some cases destroyed by decisions made in the name of a system that Ali Khamenei has led for more than 30 years. The complexity of the man does not dissolve the weight of that. It simply insists that we hold both the human being and the consequences in the same frame, without letting either crowd out the other. Because that is what serious history demands. Not the simple story, not the hero, and not the villain, the person in full. In his later decades, the world around Khamenei has changed with a speed that would have been unimaginable even 20 years ago. The Middle East has been remade by wars, by the Arab Spring, by the rise and fall of ISIS, by the shifting of great power competition into a region that had already endured more than its share of external intervention. Iran's regional influence has expanded in ways that Khamenei has actively cultivated through support for Hezbollah in Lebanon, for allied militias in Iraq and Syria and Yemen, through the construction of what his government calls an axis of resistance and what its critics call a network of destabilization. The nuclear program has advanced to a point that has placed Iran on the threshold of a capability that changes the strategic calculus of the entire region. These are the achievements, if that is the right word, of a long and consistent strategic vision. Whatever you think of that vision, whatever you think of its human costs, its regional consequences, its compatibility with the aspirations of the Iranian people themselves, it has been executed with a patience and a coherence that demands to be reckoned with. Khamenei has been playing a very long game, and on his own terms, by his own definition of what Iran needed to be and become, he has not lost. But there is another way to measure a life, another set of terms. The Iran that Khamenei has led into the 21st century is a country of extraordinary human capital, educated, young, creative, entrepreneurial, with a cultural richness that goes back thousands of years, and a population that by every available measure yearns for a fuller participation in the world.